All right, so picking up where we left off, we have some frames keyed up here, some slow in, some poses, some slow in, slow out happening on the arcs, which looks good. Now, my arcs are not exactly perfect, but what's good about using onion skin is that you can see the shape of your arcs as you're placing your ball in its path. And so that helps out a lot. What we're going to do today is get into a little bit of squash and stretch because I've kind of left off right here. And now we're ready to get into some stretching, some squashing, and then stretching again on each of these bounces. So let's go ahead and tackle that. I'm going to start off with making sure my other layers are locked. I'm on my ball layer now, and I'm ready to move on to my next frame. So I'm going to select my frame. I'm going to hit F6 on my keyboard, and I'm going to use my move tool or selection tool, and press V on my keyboard and grab this and move it along. Now I'm going to need to do some transforming on this, so I can go to my free transform tool or press Q on my keyboard and do some stretching here. So I'm going to squeeze this in, but remember, as you're doing this, you want to keep the ball in the same volume, essentially. So as it squeezes in, it should be stretching out. And then I'm going to rotate it so it stays along the path here. And I'm going to add a couple of these. Right before it hits the ground, you should have the most exaggerated, stretch. And I'm going to go to the next frame now, hit F6, move this down further, rotate a little bit so it stays along the path. I'm just kind of lining these up, squeeze it towards the middle, stretch it out this way. It's not quite hitting the ground yet because once it hits the ground, it should be right here, but I already have this keyed up here. Okay, so there's going to be some moving of frames around. Definitely left enough space here that now we're going to condense this into smaller bits. So when I hover over this frame, I can see a little white box there. It tells me that I can shift this frame over. But then I'm going to end up with bigger gaps down the way. So what I'm going to do is click that frame, shift select, and click the last frame here. And now with that box, that white box showing next to my cursor, I'm going to click this and drag it where I need it to be. So I'm going to drag it right after my last frame that I completed. So right there. So now when I go back, it's all lined up in the correct place. So I can kind of see my path here. Looks good with my onion skinning. Now this one, it's on the ground, so I'm going to squash it. And I'm going to squash it really exaggerated like this. Really exaggerated. I'm going to place it down here just above this line, because that's my point of impact, is this line right here. So I'm really stretched it out. So it goes from immediate like stretch to squash. Boom, boom. And then what it's going to do again is this very next frame, I'm going to keyframe that. And what I'm actually going to do is reshape this. I can take this, reshape it, and bring it back to a little bit more stretchiness. Raise it above the ground, squash that way, stretch this way, right? Not as much this way because this emphasizes speed when you see these frames like that. Speed before impact, and then it lifts off again. Not as big of an arc on this one, so it's not going to be as exaggerated of a stretch. But I feel like I do need to alter this a little bit to kind of match the volume that I'm going for, and rotate. Now, an issue with this is that I have lighting issues. Now my highlight is on the lower half of my ball. So what I can do is go to Modify, Transform, Flip Horizontal. Now, if I rotate it back, now my highlight is on the correct side of the ball. So it's on the top half now. which is good. Now I'm going to go to my next frame, hit F6, go to here, and actually that might be too much. So you know what? I'm going to clear this keyframe, and I'm going to start shifting my frames down, because I think that's a good transition. The only thing I might have to do with this particular frame is maybe shift it just a little bit. And then it overlaps a lot here. Here, I might shift it this way a little bit. Now, on this frame, between this one and this one, which is here, I'm going to add another stretch here. So I'm going to go to frame 16 in my case. Yours might be different. I'm going to hit F6. I'm going to add a little bit of stretch. Rotate. In this case, my highlight is on the correct side of the ball. So now it's here. My very next frame is going to be impact on the ground, which is here. So I'm going to shift this down, and I'm going to add some squash on this one. Move it down on the ground line. Not as much exaggeration as it was the first time around, which I can see here, so I can kind of compare. And then I'm going to go back to my next frame, hit F6, return this kind of back to normal shape. Ooh, don't want to skew it really. Something like that, as it stretches back out. The next frame is here, so I'm going to start shifting these down again. So I've given myself a lot of room to play. So now I've got this good arch. I think that lines up pretty well there. And so it leaves off here, and then maybe a tiny bit of stretch before it hits the ground in my next frame. So I'm going to go to my next frame here, F6, rotate, little squash, little stretch, place it right here, not completely on the ground yet. Here's my next frame, slide it over a bit, add just a tiny bit of squash here. Next frame. Actually, what I can do is go to my previous frame, see that, and what I can do, I want that basically here. I could copy a frame, go here, and paste a frame. Now I can just move it over rather than having to reshape everything. I can reuse some of these. And I would need to rotate that actually. So transform, flip horizontal, so that highlight is on the top half there. And there I go. And so now my next frames, I'm just going to squeeze these guys closer together. Goes up. And what happens actually after that doesn't really matter. In fact, I might take a little bit of this and squeeze these two guys closer together. And it actually ends right after that. So I'm just going to squeeze it all together. It ends up being 30 frames in my case. I'm going to look at this closer and tweak it and move possibly some of these balls, location of these, maybe tighter together towards the top to kind of exaggerate that slow in and slow out, and then space them apart here as they speed up, and that will add some exaggeration. So if I play this now, Control Enter, pretty good little motion there, not too shabby. Now I could do that preview here as well. I can do play, but I have a lot of dead space, so I'm going to create a loop and move the end of my loop to here. So now it's only going to play the action that I actually have animated. It gives me a clear look at what got going on. That's a pretty good little bounce. Might tweak a couple things here and there, but for the most part, that squash and stretch is looking pretty good in between those slow in, slow out areas. So that's all for now, and we'll see you next time with some shadow layers.